Challenges segment of our podcast, where we take some time to discuss the value of nuance in an internet world where nuance is increasingly fading away. I am Josh_Carmen on Twitter. He is at James YUILE.
It's amazing that your parents thought ahead to make your middle name _.
Yeah, it was pretty nice, man. They really set me up for the golden age.
John has a hyphen, so.
There you go.
Yeah, so and Chris was the only one who got a normal person name, indicative of the region in which he grew up, which is like...
Because I'm the most normal person you know.
And out of this family, you are. So this segment, this time we're going to talk about the idea of addiction and just the little bit that we know, kind of the personal studying that we've done of that, and how the church tends to respond, and whether or not we kind of think that is good or what we would like to see differently, particularly in the realm of pastoral leadership. And so I wanted to take a minute just to kind of set the context for why we were talking about this. A few weeks ago, we did a segment on body positivity there, and we were chastising the ridiculousness to the level of which this one person had taken it. And I had gotten a text that was talking about and kind of asking for since, all right, you guys knocked out the low-hanging fruit, is there a way to be a little bit more nuanced on it there? And I thought that was a fair...
No.
Again, where nuance is increasingly disappearing on the internet. So I thought that was kind of a fair question. And so it got me thinking about what we see as... and like addictions to food, or when people like use food as a coping mechanism or as a crutch in those types of things. And so it led me, I guess, more to the broader concept of addiction in general, whether that's to drugs, alcohol, things like pornography or whatever. And I think one of the...
all the best things in life.
The two big things that we see, particularly in pastoral leadership, or at least in my own experience, are pastors who overeat, or who,
really?
Heavier set pastors. And I know... probably more than my fair share of pastors who struggle with their weight.
Pastors that way.
And then pastors who have the addiction of pornography. Those are the two with which I am most familiar. And so I wanted to talk about that for a second because it was interesting to me how we typically understand addiction and kind of my own preconceived notions of it. And then as I started reading on it and kind of listening to, lectures and doctors talk about it in preparation for this, it really... I feel like kind of changed and expanded my understanding of what addiction is and the church's necessary response for that. So just a quick thing. You have kind of two major parts of you have several major parts of your brains, but the two I want to focus on are your prefrontal cortex and then your limbic system, right? So your prefrontal cortex is the thing that is fully developed when you're in your mid-20s that deals with like rational decision-making, consequences, and ideas of guilt and shame and that kind of stuff.
Allows you to think more nuanced as well.
Yeah.
Something you can't do as well when you're in your teens.
Right. And so the limbic system is the part of your brain that's often described as the reptilian brain or the more subconscious level, the instinctual side of stuff. And so the limbic system is not associated with guilt, shame. The limbic system doesn't have that function as its primary MO. What the limbic system refers to are brain areas that control kind of the emotions and the releasing of mood regulating hormones and neurotransmitters. And so this is, it's more on par with like a lion that's hungry. So when a lion's hungry, it eats. And then when it's tired, it sleeps. And that kind of thing is the operating response of the limbic system, which also governs our fight or flight method. And so when we get to a point where we start engaging the understanding of our limbic system more, we understand that the limbic system's job, in part, is to protect the body and the brain from emotional damage or physical damage or whatever type of something that's seen as a threat to the body's survival. And so that includes things like pain, and that includes things like suffering. And so people develop these crutches, right, to help cope with whatever pain it is that they're going through. And that's how what I've seen and what I've been, kind of informed by the medical community, that that's how that functions as a huge contributor to what addiction looks like in general. And so because of that, I began to wonder that addiction is just more than not being able to stop sinning, right? And so we often see it and we hear so frequently like, hey, if this is a problem for you, why don't you just stop, right?
Mm-hmm.
If this is an issue, how come you can't just cut it out? Or, when I was just about to enter into junior high, the church that I was at fired the junior high school youth pastor for his viewing of pornography, in part because he did it on the work computer, mainly
a problem.
Yeah, mainly because he was viewing pornography in general and dealing with that and struggling with the sexual immorality, and then also because he had denied it and kind of lied about it several times. And so, fair enough. I don't disagree that it wasn't a bad decision to fire. I think if you cover it up, you should. You're not living above reproach, and you got to deal with those consequences. But I think a better understanding of what true healing kind of looks like is the idea of how to help somebody deal with addiction. Because if you're telling somebody to stop doing that, right, or if you're having and helping and encouraging someone to finish their struggle or gain the upper hand on their struggle with whatever addiction they're facing, be it food, pornography, alcohol, drugs, working out, I don't know. You're really
One of
asking
the more
them,
acceptable addictions.
right.
Yeah.
And that's, I've seen a lot of friends of mine who are alcoholics who are now living sober are just gym rats there, and it is like eat, sleep, breathe, gym, fitness, working out, being just totally all about that life, which is interesting, but it's just you're swapping, right? Or
Well, it is a good swap though.
yeah, totally, and and I don't think
Unless
that,
you like start destroying your body.
and or trading alcohol for cigarettes, and that kind of
Yeah.
thing, and I've seen that a lot. But so I ask, when we have this nuanced discussion, what do we think the church's response should be for people, and in particular pastors who struggle with these types of addictions that everybody has to some degree?
Well, you mentioned sin right there in the middle somewhere, talking about how we view addiction as some sort of sin. And I'm going to agree with that, but I'm going to now change the definition of sin.
Ooh, for the whole Christendom. Here we go.
Faith and whatever, and hearsay.
Now, anybody who has really dug into biblical studies knows that there's some different...
Sin is not real.
No, it's not right. There's some different conceptualizations of sin in the New Testament. The one I kind of want to focus in on right now is the way it seems to appear when Jesus is speaking about sin. And essentially what it amounts to is this. It comes from the Greek word. Usually when you see the English word sin, it's coming from the Greek word hamartia.
Mm-hmm.
Hamartia comes from Greek archery. And it was the term used when an archer shot an arrow and missed the bullseye.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about missing the bullseye is you might miss it by an inch. You might miss it by a mile, right? And
You might have shot the guy in the third row.
so the idea is it's missing the mark. How far? Context tells you, but it's missing the mark. And yes, that's what sin is. Sin is missing the mark, which would be, in a Christian context, God's ideal. Missing God's ideal. Why are we all sinners? Because we all miss God's ideal somewhat. Some of us more, some of us less, but all of us some. And addiction is missing the ideal. Now, does that mean it's some kind of seedy, dark, nasty, demonic sin? No, that's not a very good nuance of the situation. But it's about maybe missing the mark of God's ideal for humanity, right? I would say most addiction falls into that category. And yes, in that way, it is hamartia. It's missing the mark. And so what should the church's response to missing the mark be? It should be trying to help people get closer to the bullseye.
Right.
Now, what does that look like? Now we start having a far more complicated conversation. But yeah, I mean, it should be essentially the role of the church on earth is to help humanity meet the ideal as close as possible, whether that be through dealing with poverty or dealing with personal vice or dealing with some sort of addiction. The role of the church, the primary role, I would argue, is one way of wording it is to embody the kingdom of God on earth. But what is the kingdom of God? It's meeting God's ideal.
Right. Totally.
As a community.
Yeah, totally in community.
And so that is the primary job of the church. That's the primary identity of the church, is to do that. I want to pass the conversation here to Chris, because I feel like I'm talking over something Chris maybe had planned to say.
Nope.
Oh.
No, go ahead. I have things to say, but go ahead and finish.
No, go ahead.
I was just because thinking this. One of the things that I think it makes this real difficult to talk about in some ways is that the church's response is pretty varied.
Yeah.
Now we've seen I don't want to be too specific about things that didn't involve me, but there was a relatively local church that had a problem with their pastor was having an affair. And he was removed as the pastor, but not as a member. And he stayed a member of the church. And,
That's surprising.
Yeah, and
It was awesome.
yeah, it was a beautiful example of healing and reconciliation and all these other ideals that we strive for. And I don't know if he was ever became a pastor again or whatever happened to it. I didn't go to the church, and I heard everything third person. That's why I didn't want to be too specific. But so it's hard to say, well, the church does this, the church does that, when I mean different churches do a lot of different things, especially since I think we're all non-denominational churches, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we all do all kinds of different things.
A very big church in Southern California, church movement is the Calvary Chapel church movement.
Right.
And essentially, their big start was the person who started them, Chuck Smith. I believe that's his name. I hope I'm not confusing him with
No,
a
you're
different
right.
Smith. Chuck Smith, he himself wasn't an addict that I know of, but I think his ministry was often to addicts. Not at first, but that's what it grew into. And that Calvary Chapel is one of the biggest church movements in Southern California, if not maybe the Pacific of America right now. And it's because they learned how to minister to addiction well. I have some other complaints about Calvary Chapel, but certainly that's not one of them. That's a great positive of that church.
I think there are a lot of topics where we could say that the church has not handled this well, but I think generally speaking, there are plenty of good examples of the church acting as it relates to addiction, or in dealing with helping people deal with their addictions.
I have seen it move fairly well in the area of the layperson, right? But my emphasis is more on the idea of the pastoral side.
Okay.
There, and that's where my curiosity is piqued there, because when I read this and kind of when I learned about this, the idea of like helping somebody overcome any type of an addiction, what is you are literally asking the person to starve a portion of themselves that their body has kind of dealt or learned how to cope with. So you are saying, hey, look, replace this, kill this part of yourself, right, and grow into something better, which I totally think is what Christ calls us to do, and I think a part of that is the dying to self daily, and I'm all for that. But so I'm curious, I guess maybe experientially.
Well, it occurs to me when we're talking about pastoral staff and addiction, it occurs to me that this is part of the problem here is having professional pastors.
Right.
As far as I can tell, the earliest church was mostly a volunteer-led body. It was believers sort of charismatically led their communities, and based on their gifts of leadership or other things, they led their communities there. But there is very few examples of some sort of paid minister in the earliest church that we can tell. I mean, you might argue Paul, but even Paul wasn't. He had another job.
I mean, he was a tent maker, right?
Right. He was a tanner or a tent maker, and supported himself that way. And so I think part of the problem is by creating the profession of the minister. And by the way, I'm a professional minister.
Yeah.
Creating the profession of the minister, we've if your volunteer minister comes into a dark time, it's not a fall from the pedestal necessarily to ask him to be a more passive member of the church and to let other people sort of take over that role. But if it's his profession, if it's his income or her income, if it's
whoa, careful. No,
if it's his or her retirement, right, to call out a missing the mark in the form of addiction, and to take that away from the person is a much bigger life impact.
Right, and so that's where I wonder, because there's not a chance that we're stopping that structure that we've built right over the last 2,000 years.
That's not going away.
And so how do we better deal with that? And so I have had friends who tell me, who are in youth ministry or some other, kind of that age range of ministry, where they say, look, I have a problem with pornography specifically, but there's no way I could ever open up about this, because then my wife and I wouldn't have a place to live. And so
I'd lose a job.
Yeah, and there's a pigeonhole that happens in there. So I'm curious just about the idea of like, what is a better way that we deal with that, almost like a Pastors Anonymous kind of thing, or that. And so that's what led me into this practical side of our discussion. If we're helping people who struggle with something like food addiction, there's a pretty clear path, right? Help them go to the gym, encourage them.
Could you have an alcoholic running Alcoholics Anonymous?
I mean, technically it is.
Well, I mean, I know they say you're never cured; you're always in recovery.
But not an active
right.
alcoholic.
So,
right?
how can you have somebody who's struggling with a chronic, persistent sin leading? I mean,
or put it another way, if you had sort of a secret group of pastors helping each other with their vices and their addictions, and it came out, it'd be a pastoral cover-up.
Right.
All these pastors knew what this guy was doing.
Yeah.
Right?
And so, and that's what I'm curious about is how do we, as people help pastoral folk through their journey of addiction in that thing, or do we can them, or do we ask them to step down and then maybe reinstate them later on, or like, what does that do just for the sake? Because if simply removing them at kind of the smaller church model, which is what most people are in, right, would just be crippling for the ministry.
I also don't like the disappearing.
Yeah.
Like, we're just like, hey, where's the pastor?
Yeah. No, he's not here anymore.
Yeah, just all of a sudden the pastor's gone, and
right.
I don't think that's ever a good way to handle.
Yeah, and so clearly, like, there's some middle ground there, and so that's what I'm ultimately getting at is, do you have an idea for whether or not, first of all, answer this question: do you think we should journey with pastors who struggle through their addiction, whatever that could be, right? I have friends who struggle desperately with bitterness and jealousy and kind of holding a grudge there, and people who struggle with their weight and overeating and, just not living a life that's whatever healthily in that regard, and then people who struggle with, pornography, whatever it is. Do you journey with pastors through that, or do you remove them and their influence and is it simply does the good outweigh the bad, that kind of thing, and whichever way you lean on that, how do you help kind of improve that?
Yeah, and there's going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate here. The other side of this, too, is part of being a pastor, being a minister, ideally, is that you might have gone through these things earlier in life, but you're in a place where you know how to guide other people out of it.
Through them, yeah, totally.
And if that's the basic job description, then do you fit the job description? Do you know
if you
how
can't
to
do the
lead
job,
people?
then
Yeah. Do you know how to lead people out of these things if you haven't led yourself?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the sort of when Paul, or the author of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, the pastoral epistles, talks about picking leaders in the church. The descriptions are older people who have sort of gone through life and have come out righteous and know how to help other people get through life and come out righteous. So there's a bit of a challenge here, because it's like, what profession can we say, well, you can't live up to the basic tenets of the job, but you still get to keep your job, right? I mean, being a pastor is about being able to lead people into a life of Christ-likeness.
Yeah, totally.
And not to say that a pastor needs to be perfect, absolutely not. But there's certainly levels of imperfectness.
Yeah. So where do you draw that line, just in your own personal?
Well,
opinion?
first of all, I don't know. Let's just throw that out there right now.
But that's not allowed. This is the internet.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say up front, I'm not the person to answer these questions for everybody.
Yeah, no.
I mean, I'm the person who can think about these questions
totally.
and ruminate on them. I would say that, first of all, for people thinking about getting into ministry, it's a life of great sacrifice. Most ministers don't make a ton of money. They lead difficult pastoral jobs where they put in far more than 40 hours a week. And you're called to sacrifice things such as, if you have a pornography addiction, you brought up that example a couple times, well, ministry, the pastoral ministry, calls you to then give up computers and to give up anything where you might come in contact with such things. And so if you are not comfortable with a life of great sacrifice, you may not be good for being a full-time
cut from that
pastor.
fabric is all. Yeah.
And I say that as a person, I don't struggle with pornography, but I'm a person who is never going to be a full-time pastor because of that. Because there is a certain life of sacrifice there that I don't think I can do. I can do professional ministry to a degree. I do it part-time, but I'll never be cut out for the full-time job. There's certain elements of the job that I just can't live up to. And I just need to be honest with myself about that. And you, viewer, you need to be honest about yourself, with yourself about these things too. Excuse me. Sorry, still sick from having less blood in my body. Anyway, what should the churches... honestly, there are people who do a profession and then in their, let's say, late 30s, early 40s, even 50s, decide they want to be ministers and they do a whole career change to become ministers. Well, there might be some ministers who need to do a career change out of ministry.
Yeah, sure.
And what they need is to be able to be a church member who allows the church to help them through their addiction, whatever it may be, and not be a professional working at that church. I think that's the only... It's not that that's the best answer. That's certainly not James Yule's ideal answer, but I think that's the only answer that really works in this situation. I can't think of a church keeping... it depends on the addiction.
Right.
But keeping on staff a pastor whose certain addiction inhibits the job greatly.
Yeah.
Or
Totally.
inhibits the ability to have the reputation to do that job.
Yeah.
I just can't. I'm sure there's some great story out there of some magical church that pulled this off, but you can't expect that of many churches.
Right.
So I don't know what to say really in this. I'm not trying to be judgmental here. I'm trying to think about what happens in the real world.
Yeah.
What happens in the real world is kind of itchy and sticky and awful, and I think you should just... Yeah, I'm not sure what my thoughts are on this.
You have any ideas, Chris?
Well, I'm not real well known for my sympathy. So I grew up with a lot of what would be larger than life examples of awesome ministers.
Yeah.
And out on the mission field, and people who were missionaries. I mean, it wasn't as bad as the generation that came before them, but they had it a lot harder than the missionaries who go out now.
Yeah.
And it was the kind of thing where you really had to be a diehard to do the job.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I mentioned that to say this, that maybe my own perspective is a little skewed by that. Watching these people who were larger than life for me as a child. And but basically, for me...
You mean just kill it so well?
Yeah, they were just... guys like Dennis McKinney and, not even... Dad's always been my hero. But a lot of the guys he worked with, and the Selbys and actually all the McKinneys are all amazing people. And so there was... On the mission field, especially back then, there wasn't time for... either you could hack it or you couldn't.
Yeah.
And if you couldn't, you get out.
Yeah.
Right.
And they weren't ever mean like that about it. But that's just the world.
Right.
If you can do the job, come do the job. If you can't do the job for whatever reason, then you need to leave. And that doesn't mean you can't be useful to the kingdom, but this isn't the place for you. And I kind of feel like that with ministry. It's a tough job.
Yeah. There's a million ways to be useful to the kingdom.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
not pastoral ministry.
Right.
And if you're struggling with this or struggling with that, then either go deal with it and come back, or find another way to serve.
Yeah, there's a sort of anecdotal humorous story that a professor that taught me a lot about life and ministry once said, he has a lot of tales I'll never forget, but he said there's this guy planting corn. He was working in a cornfield. He was a farmer, and he was
Are you just telling us a parable?
It's sort of a parable.
Oh, okay.
But he wasn't sure if he should spend the rest of his life being a farmer or if he should go into ministry. He felt like there's this, he had been reading the New Testament, and he felt like he should go into ministry, and he didn't know which way to go. And he looked up into the sky, and he saw in the clouds GPC in the clouds. And he said, "That's my sign from God. Go preach Christ." Then he spends...
I thought it was go produce corn.
Then he goes...
I thought it was gutter punk cigarettes.
So then he spends the next decades of his life trying to do ministry, failing repeatedly, but thinking, I saw GPC in the sky, I'm supposed to go preach Christ. He keeps doing it. He just keeps failing. He has a terrible life of ministry until he finally dies. He goes to the pearly gates. He says, "I have a bone to pick with you. You told me to go preach Christ, and I did, and I was an utter failure the whole time. And God said it was go plant corn,
Yeah.
right? The moral of the story is do for God's kingdom based on your skill set and your gifts that are apparent to you, not based on just some emotional calling you might have. We all have these times in our lives when we felt very emotionally called to something that's might going to blow up in our faces. Instead, take a real look over the actual gifts you have available to you, what you could do well, and how can you somebody who planted corn for the next 3 decades of their lives could have fed a lot of people, could have donated to other people to do great ministry, and who would have done more in ministry than that he could have, right? And this is just an anecdotal story, obviously.
Right.
But it's not even an anecdote. It's just sort of a parable in a sense. But the idea is there's 1,000 ways to serve God without having to pull a paycheck from it.
Yeah, and even, like, I don't want to sound too harsh with what I said, but I say it as somebody who, I used to play guitar in the church band, and I stepped down. Because I do believe that there's a standard you have to live to that is much tougher if you want to be in ministry. And at that time in my life, I didn't want to live to that standard, and I didn't want to basically be a liar and say that I was.
Right.
And so I chose to step down, and I don't. So what I say might sound harsh, but I'm saying it as somebody who couldn't live up to it either.
Yeah, who did it.
Yeah.
Who was at least consistent about it. Yeah, and that's interesting. I think I might be on the other side a little bit, being a little bit more sympathetic for that in terms of walking through with somebody.
Well, I'm not judging walking through with somebody, but the idea is, should that person be a minister?
Yeah, and that's what I mean. So allowing the ministry of that person to continue, but walking through.
But can it continue is the question.
Yeah, and obviously that's a case-by-case basis. Yeah. I think my default is to tend to lean towards that side a little bit, but I don't know. So if you have any thoughts, if you are a friend of the podcast and you are watching this, we would love to kind of hear what you would think. This actually turned out far better than anything I could have hoped for as far as the conversation goes. Food addiction, drug addiction, clearly not,
awesome addiction.
Yeah, if you're just too good at being a pastor.
So awesome.
If we ever meet anybody like that, I would love to have them
making
on
all
this
the other
podcast.
pastors look bad.
Yeah, thanks, Dad. So we would love to hear your thoughts. We are, again, at facebook.com/faithandwhatever. And we would, love to hear from you there. And if you want to reach us on Twitter, we are at faithandwhatever.